All right, just go. All right, so I'll try to enunciate all the way to the back. I guess the first question, I think this, for one thing, I wanted to say that Miranda's talk was a great lead-in. You'll see a lot of connections. And I feel like I'm going to show you some research methods. That's part of my job here. But in fact, you saw a lot of research methods in that talk. And it was really rich with her own methods and so on. So that was really, really terrific. I do want to say that this particular topic has a connection to human health, obviously. And I'm just curious to know, can we just see a show of hands? How many people have had Lyme disease? All right, hands down. How many people have had Lyme disease or know someone who has Lyme disease? Oh my gosh. All right, hands down. How many people have had babesiosis? It was very interesting. It's actually a protozoan carried by ticks, like malaria is carried by mosquitoes, except it's here in Waltham and elsewhere in New England. How about histoplasmosis? Anyone with histo? All right. Ehrlichiosis or other tick-borne diseases. How about Powassan virus? Thank goodness, no one has had that. And just curious to see what the audience familiarity with some of these topics is. And so we'll dive right in here, but I think this should be of interest to most folks. How many from the New England area? All right. How about the southeast? The west? Okay. So the real problem area is the northeast and Wisconsin, as you probably know. But those of you from elsewhere, watch out. This might be heading your way. And here, just a quick introduction to one of the main culprit here is the black-legged tick, also known as the deer tick, Ixodes scapularis, and that's a female. I was telling my research to one of the women who works in the cafeteria. She said, "Oh, you mean the red-ass tick?" That's you could put it that way, I guess. So she's a local gal. She's great. And so this is an example of the tick. My gosh, what a life. That's what they do most of the time if they're not on a mammal or a bird yet. It's called questing. Isn't that a romantic term? That's actually the official word for this behavior of going to the top of a leaf or a grass stem, always quite low. They don't jump. They don't fall on you from trees. They're quite low, at thigh height at best. And they hold their legs out and wait, and wait, and wait. I mean, if they had any sort of actual intellectual capacity, they would be bored to death. But fortunately, I think they just sort of slumber away in their tick world and wait. And eventually, something brushes by, if they're lucky, and they hitch a ride. And again, if they're lucky, they don't get groomed off or fall off or something, and they manage to get a blood meal. Here's our variety of ticks in our area. The Lone Star tick, the dog tick is significantly larger, and the one we're going to focus on here is the deer tick or black-legged tick. And I actually have some collected on Monday, and so this is a vial. They can't get out, don't worry. I'll just pass this around. There's a big one that's an adult male, and then all the little specks that are crawling around in the vial are nymphs, and they're the ones that cause a lot of the trouble. So we'll start over here, and we'll just pass that around. You can kind of hold it up near the screen, and you can see the little specks. And the problem is this. This where did I go here? What happened? There we go. The nymph. The nymph is here. The larva is the smallest of the stages, just out of the egg, but really small is of course the bacterium itself. I heard a pathologist from Yale think about this and said it's remarkable how many different kinds of organisms this one tick carries, from bacteria to virus to that protozoan like malaria thing I mentioned. Where are these diseases tending to be most problematic? Again, it's the Northeast, and for some reason it seemed to skip Michigan. I don't know what happened in Michigan, but they're very lucky, mostly has skipped that area. But it's a serious problem in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And as I was saying, it's just quite astonishing. You know, you think about most diseases, the West Nile virus has a particular species of malaria that carries it. Malaria itself, a particular kind of mosquito, malaria, a particular species of mosquito. The mosquitoes that carry malaria are not the same as those that carry, let's say, dengue. And so you have this specificity of pathogens. And here you have this really broad range of bacterial species in the deer tick, up there with Lyme disease, a couple of species of Lyme, actually. Then anaplasmosis, I think I said histo. This is anaplasmosis, is the one that the deer tick carries, and babesiosis. That's a bacteria, a protozoan that invades your red blood cells, and then there's the virus. So we have sort of three kingdoms of life represented there in one vector, which is quite remarkable. So just to sort of step back for a minute, though, and put this into the context of disease ecology, I guess we could call it. There's known as of 2001, when this review paper was written, a little over 1,400 species of infectious disease. And there's the sort of variety, just to remind you, of viruses, bacteria, fungi, protozoans, and the multicellular worms, the helminths. And of this total, 868 are found in organisms other than humans. And so rabies, of course, is a famous example. There's, you catch rabies by being bitten by some infected animal, and it's transferred in the saliva. These diseases that we share with other animals, that we can catch from other animals, are known as the zoonoses. And so altogether, as of 2001, these were still causing some 25% of human deaths around the world. So infectious disease remains a serious problem. And this is in spite of the fact that when penicillin was invented in 1928, there was enormous optimism. This was the first time doctors really had something they could give you that would work, other than bed rest and tea with milk or something. And we have this great quote from Sir Macfarlane Burnet, who wrote in his Natural History of Infectious Disease that most likely forecast about the future of infectious disease is that it will be very dull. We really did think that we could win. And it was such a great example of one of those quotes about the future that we can now sort of look back and laugh a little bit. Something like the fact, what was that quote about? No one really needs a personal computer. That was a IBM CEO once said that. But look at the variety of infectious diseases that are the ones in blue are sort of resurging or re-emerging. They're known diseases that are becoming more common for some reason. And then the red ones are really new things that are not well understood. We may have had a few examples of them in the past, but they're really becoming a serious health problem in some areas, at least now and then, in an unexpected way. And Lyme is up there as something that's re-emerging or resurging. And notice that Zika and chikungunya virus are not even on this map yet. So we have an increasing number of these diseases. Some of them have no cure. You simply give the patient bed rest, and they fight it off with their immune system if they can. So I think those of you in the medical library world, you have a very secure career. You can relax, right? And so one researcher asked the question, are these emerging diseases more likely to be from wildlife than we expect by chance alone? And so they looked at this question, and they found that 75% of the emerging diseases, like Zika and Ebola and some of these others, are in fact coming out of, they have a reservoir host or several reservoir hosts in wildlife. And another way to say it, like 96% of the emerging genera, 81% are coming from wildlife. Just 62% or so of the non-emerging genera are zoonoses. And so I just ran a very simple statistical test. The ecologists in the room can tell me if this is valid. But this is just a very simple 2x2 contingency table, and I found that there was an association with the rows and the columns that, in other words, the association is very unlikely to be by chance alone, that more than expected by chance alone of these emerging diseases are coming from wildlife. And we might ask why. The increased spread of humans into all corners of the world. Global trade is moving species around. That can contribute to the spread of diseases, obviously. Ecological disruption, fragmentation, climate change, land use change, increased contact with wildlife, just with, and you can think of the United States as a place where perhaps we used to be more of an urban-rural divide, and now more and more people live in the suburbs where they can come into contact with wild animals, and in fact like to come into contact with wild animals, not so much as hunters, but more as just appreciators. And then we have the growth in populations of domestic animals that can often serve as a kind of bridge. So you see that in some of the viruses in Southeast Asia, where the pigs will feed on fruit that were eaten for partially eaten by the bats. The pigs become infected, and now the pig farmer becomes infected after the pigs are rounded up from the forest. Things of that sort. So all of these, probably to some extent, contribute to this emergence of more of these zoonotic pathogens. And again, the example is the Nipah virus that was tracked through pigs to bats, and flying foxes are the natural reservoir. So these diseases are kind of like the herpes virus in humans. They can just persist without actually causing much severe illness. And then they are transmitted either via the blood or the bites or the vectors, like we're going to look at today with ticks and so on, moving pathogens from wildlife into humans. And so there's a really important ecological or medical/ecology lesson in this. If a disease is caused by a pathogen that's only found in humans, it could be eradicated. Who can think of an example of a disease that we humans have completely eradicated? Yes? Smallpox. It's in deep freezers. Apparently there's some in the former Soviet Union and some in the United States where we're holding it in deep freeze in case there's ever an outbreak again and we need to develop a vaccine. But that's pretty much gone from the wild. We've actually caused deliberately the extinction of a species, a smallpox virus. We're close with a couple others. Does anyone know? Yes? What's that? Yes, we're very close with this terrible helminth called guinea worm. Thank goodness to the Carter Center and their partners. That's one that's nearly gone. It's amazing. And then a couple others. Anyone think of another one? Polio. And polio continues to be stubbornly resistant, but we are very close to that. I have dear friends who are still suffering from their infection when they were kids. So it's that recent, it was in the United States. And perhaps even some of you were once afflicted by this disease. So if a disease is an active zoonosis, though, it's a very different thing. We can never really eradicate it. And what do we have to do in that case? Well, we have to emphasize completely other measures in public health. For example, we have to vaccinate every child or perform whatever is done to control the disease. And essentially, we will do that forever. Example is yellow fever. If yellow fever is endemic to your area, you must become vaccinated. It's in the primates, and mosquitoes will bite primates and carry it to you. And so, but gosh, we have vaccines, right? We have antibiotics. We will win, right? Like that optimistic view has. Well, I'm not so sure. But this is breaking news. As of just a few days ago, a couple weeks ago, the UMass Medical School in Worcester announced that they have very promising results with a one-shot Lyme prep. And the problem with the Lyme vaccine was you needed to take it 3 times a year. There was evidence that side effect was arthritis. And then, of course, the big anti-vaccination campaign kicked in and said, no, we're not going to allow you to vaccinate our children 3 times a year. That's not going to work for us. And so it was withdrawn from the market, and we haven't had anything since. Just your own cautions. That's all you really have in terms of avoiding Lyme. And well, once you get it, of course, you take a really good antibiotic that nearly always nips it in the bud. Doxycycline worked for me, and I hope it has worked for most of you. But it isn't the fact we aren't winning in the sense that Lyme disease is not going down. In fact, if anything, we have an increase in the reporting in Massachusetts, in the United States, and there is, of course, always a complexity of awareness and reporting among the medical profession that may contribute partly to this rise. But even though it's supposed to be a reportable illness, in other words, every physician who prescribes doxy for Lyme is supposed to alert the CDC, but we don't really do that. And so it turns out, based on a couple different ways of studying this, the CDC announced in, 2013, that they believe the medical community is vastly underreporting Lyme disease, and the true number is somewhere not 30,000 new cases a year, but 300,000 new cases a year. And if you assume that, if it is the case that each new case is a new person, after 10 years, 1% of the population of the country close to will have had Lyme disease. So it's a very serious problem. Fortunately, the other diseases I've mentioned are much rarer. Babesiosis and ehrlichiosis and so on are significantly rarer. Powassan virus is terrible, and it apparently can be transmitted very quickly from the tick, and it is really rare, and my gosh, we hope it stays rare because it's really bad. And so why do I care so much? Well, I really have been, in my career, started after college as a field naturalist at nature centers. Some of you may know, like Drumlin Farm here in the Boston area. I worked at places like that out in Minnesota. I'm a parent. I took my kids hiking and fishing. I myself am an ecologist because my parents took me camping and fishing, and my grandfather was a big game hunter, had been to Africa, and I grew up immersed in nature. And we see this is a 2018 study, one of many, that shows that kids playing around and building forts and damming up creeks and so on it creates healthy kids, it creates our future conservationists and biologists, enriches our life, and to have whole regions of the country where parents, I think if you're a wise parent, you're going to be scared. And it's going to be harder for you to let kids roam. And so this questionnaire, I work in Weston, which is just to the west of here. And that's where I do my tick research. And we ask people, I don't know why this is zipping around like this. But anyway, we ask people, what are some of the concerns? What prevents you from doing more of the activits listed in question 2? And there were a long list of activities, including, for everything from playing frisbee and bird watching and so on. A very long list. And over 25% of the people said they're scared of ticks. And they just don't go into the conservation areas of Weston as much as they'd like because of their fear of ticks. Now, these are adults mostly answering this question, but anecdotally, I talked to the coordinator of the town of Weston Conservation Department, and she said that, well, you can read it. Her children do go. She takes them stubbornly, determinedly, and she must do very careful tick checks. But she says it's getting difficult to get other kids to join in. Their parents are not letting their kids hike around and play in the forests of Weston as much as they used to. And so it really is not just a public health issue, but kind of a mental health issue and a child development problem. I see that as a multidimensional set of issues related to this fear of the forest. It's a new fear of our beautiful wild areas that it's really a pity. So let's dive now into some of the details of this. A little look at the life cycle of the tick, something about what we know about the reservoir hosts in nature. I'm not going to really touch on that relationship with oak trees in this version of my talk, but there is kind of an interesting theory about that, very contentious. I should say that, I've been really lucky over the years of this research to get to know some of these real tick biologists. As you heard from my introduction, I've got a project in Nicaragua, and I work on energy issues. Brandeis tolerates me because I'm a good teacher, but I'm not the sort of hyper-specialized ecologist that, ends up being famous for. Well, I'm pretty famous for my plant-eating spider, but that was a fluke. Anyway, 15 minutes of fame. You can look it up. And there is a look at some of the dilution effects that are interesting in terms of Amanda's mention of community ecology. We might ask, why is Lyme increasing? And then we'll look at deer hunting in Lyme. Actually, just a few of those really in detail. So let's just kind of, this is really important, so try to track this with me. Female lays eggs after taking a big blood meal and mating. The female then dies. The eggs hatch in the late summer, and you find these specks, just minute larvae on your socks, or this is the main sampling device, tick flag that you drag behind you, made of soft flannel. And there's our method. I'll show you in a minute more details on that. But when you do find the larvae on there, I've actually gotten pretty good at finding them. But when it's hard to believe these things actually become, they're truly minute. So the larvae hatch out in the late summer and fall. They take a blood meal if they're lucky. It must be like, an acorn producing 1 billion acorns. How many actually grow into an oak tree? Must be enormous mortality at the larval stage. But those that do successfully get a blood meal take it from a mouse or a chipmunk, some on birds, or other small animals in general. Then they drop into the leaf litter and molt and become a nymph. And the nymphs overwinter. So every time this curve passes January, you're in a new year. So we started in May, and now the nymphs are overwintering, and they're emerging in May, June, July. And this is just when people are going into the woods to look at migratory birds and wildflowers. And finally, the winter is over. Let's take Bruno or whatever your dog's name is into the forest and enjoy the forest. So it's really kind of a nasty trick because the nymphs are born disease-free. But when they feed on these little mammals, the reservoir hosts of the diseases, that's when they themselves become infected. And so the first time you can catch a Lyme from a particular tick in its life is in the spring of its second year. And that's when it has, about 30% of them have become infected by that time on average. So your chance of being infected by the tick you find on your thigh or in your armpit is about 1 in 3 at that point. This varies from place to place, but that's approximately the result. So the nymphs feed. Those that do successfully find a host fall back into the leaf litter and molt into the adults. And the adult male and female in the fall begin to seek larger mammals. They quest higher. Their search is higher in the leaf litter and in the grass, and therefore they're not as likely to get onto a mouse or a chipmunk, but they will wait if it seems they really have a preference for the deer. The deer and other larger mammals are where male and female are more likely to find each other. The deer is completely free of these diseases. Their immune systems are amazing. The deer immune system is so powerful, it actually clears the Lyme from the tick itself. But by then, of course, if the tick has bitten somebody, it may have transmitted the disease. It's sort of too late. The deer are not a reservoir host for Lyme. They are the walking singles bar of the adult ticks. And so we think the highest mating success and feeding success of the female is on the deer. And this is where we get this name, the deer tick. And so we finally have the adults seeking the mammalian hosts. And by the way, any time in winter, in warm weather, you can find adult ticks crawling around on you. And by the time they're adults, remember about 30% in the larval to nymphal stage have become infected, and something like half by the time they're adults because they've had a second chance to feed on a small mammal. All right. And so there you have larvae emerging, feeding on a small mammal, nymphs mostly feeding on small mammals, but also on possums and foxes, and then the adults seem to be mainly focused on the deer, and that all takes 2 years. And so we have a disease ecology study with a whole community of potential hosts, including, you see the thrush over there and robins sometimes. So this is a bird dispersed vector. You know, when the bird has a tick on it, it can fly for many scores or even hundreds of miles before the tick drops off. So it can get around pretty readily. And now we're going to just look briefly at the details of some of these hosts. And just to sort of give you some of the language you'll see here, the percent of nymphs infected, nymphal infected percent, body burden, mean number of engorged larvae collected during a 72-hour captive period of a particular mammal, molting percentage, how many successfully molted after dropping off, and the reservoir competence is a really important one. That's the infection rate of the nymphs after feeding on a particular host, particular mammal or bird. And so white-tailed deer are beloved by the adult ticks, but they're a very lousy reservoir because their immune system can clear the infection so readily. Whereas you'll see white-footed mice are extremely good. Here's this, I know it's a lot of data, but just look at the species on the left and then track across. In this particular study, they looked at 28 mice. See the N. 41% successfully molted after feeding on the mouse, and 92% of the ticks that fed on an infected mouse became infected themselves. You can now look down that from 92, look down and see some of the other really competent hosts. The eastern chipmunk, at 55% of the ticks that fed on the chipmunk became infected. These are, again, larvae to nymph. This is the larvae that are transitioning to nymphs, and the nymphs are the stage that are most problematic for people. They're active in June and July. They're still pretty small and hard to detect, and that's the little guys going around in the vial. You find the vial is still moving around, I hope. That little guys, good, are the ones that are problematic. And another are the short-tailed shrews, and the other shrews are also problematic. Look at the possum. 21 possums were collected. The way this worked was they caught the possum in the wild, held it in a cage over water for a number of days, and the ticks that were feeding on it dropped into the water, and they were able to sample them and see what their rate of infection was. And so they talk about multidisciplinary. They were working with wildlife ecologists and testing with DNA, and so it was very much a multidisciplinary study. So the possum is quite remarkable. 21 possums were captured in this study, and the reservoir competence is extremely low. Only 2.6% of the possums transmitted the Lyme to the tick. Many of the, I have to look back on this and see if this means that only 2 or 3% of the possums were themselves infected. I don't remember if they're just really good at clearing it or if they're just really bad at transmitting it. But anyway, one thing that we have learned is that possums are extremely good at grooming ticks. If you look at the blue circle under the white-footed mouse and compare it to the yellow, you see that the yellow, ticks fed and infected per hectare, is pretty large compared to the number of ticks groomed off. And then compared to the possum, they collect a lot more ticks as they roam around in the woods. They have a much wider range, perhaps, but they're extremely good at grooming them off and killing them. And the number of ticks that fed and infected were in the single digits. And so this leads me to suggest that we create a rent-a-possum program somehow. The possum turns out to be a remarkable tick vacuum cleaner. And this actually has been on places like Facebook as a kind of meme. I'm not the first to suggest rent-a-possum. One really neat study was done looking at sort of modeling some of this diversity. If you note, if a tick gets on a possum and successfully molts, it doesn't need to get on a mouse, right? If a tick gets on a raccoon and successfully molts, it doesn't need to be on a mouse, and so on down the list. And so if you have more non-competent or not very competent hosts in your forest, you may actually dilute the tendency of ticks to acquire the disease. If you just have mice, what else is there to feed on? And most of the ticks are going to become infected. So we have this theory of this dilution effect that biodiversity can actually be protective. The more variety of hosts you have in the forest, the fewer ticks are going to be transmitting disease onwards. And so they looked at this and noticed the number of mice, the green circles, is held constant across the study, and they're adding species. Each one of these circles is another species of host. And then they looked at the actual percentage of nymphal infection, and they found that the yellow dots are showing what was actually found in nature. So this was supporting their theory that greater diversity of organisms in the New England forest actually reduces the percentage of ticks infected. Interesting idea. And they're looking at things like fragmentation and the suburbanization of the forests around our metropolitan areas, reducing the number of organisms like owls and snakes and foxes and so on. The greater density in the urban, the more urbanization you impose on the landscape, the lower the number of the variety of mammals, except the mouse. The white-footed mice becomes pretty persistent in these places. And so the suggestion was that we are getting kind of through our land use changes, we're increasing the risk. And that was one theory that is still being talked about. And the notion is, predators can be good for you. If you have a way of increasing the number of mice predators, snakes and owls and so on, that might be helpful. And as mammal diversity increases, the percent of infected ticks steadily declines. It's a dilution effect. And the question is, is this real? Is it actually a management proposal? And the skeptics say, and I'm sort of paraphrasing, it's really not the proportion of infected ticks, but the absolute number that is the salient parameter in risk to humans. The proportion of infected ticks may decline, but with a greater abundance of mammals and birds, tick abundance may increase. This can enhance transmission potential among mice and so ameliorate the reduction in infection prevalence. Now, this brings us to the deer. Because if the deer truly are the, without which not for the ticks population, what could it mean? Could it be that by better managing the deer, we actually reduce risk and make our forests safe again? And so one of my advisors on this, when I started 6 years ago, was Sam Telford from Tufts. Anyone from Tufts? Anyone know Sam? All right. Anyway, he believes that deer reduction is absolutely essential for the control of the deer tick and the risk of Lyme. And we have, that really inspired my study. He did tell me when I started this study that, he said, Eric, this is going to be at least a 10-year study before you clear out noise and start to see signal. And I think he was absolutely right, as you're about to see. But just to give you a sense of the place I'm working in, this is Waltham, and here's Brandeis over here. And you see the big gray checkerboard. Of course, that's settled streets and houses with small lots. And we just shift over a few miles. Here's Waltham still and Newton, and look at the green. Weston is a very odd town. It's the highest income of any city and town in Massachusetts, and it has low density, large estates. David Ortiz lives there, for gosh sakes. It's 2,000 acres of conservation land, mostly in forest. And at a current market value of over $1 million an acre, it's $2 billion locked up in forest land. So it's a great place for an ecologist. I do wonder about its impact on local property values and scarcity of low-income housing or moderate-income housing. But anyway, that's a different story. But the fact is, it's an amazing place, and it's beautiful. This is just a few miles from us. They're very interested in the impact of the deer. This is an exclosure. You'll see that tomorrow, looking at the way the deer impact the forest in or outside of that exclosure. And the Western Conservation Commission, about 6 years ago, made this list. Look, we have 25 to 30 cars hitting deer that we know of each year. Very traumatic for the driver and the passengers. Kids on their way to soccer practice or something, and of course traumatic for the deer. We have browsing by deer heavily on gardens and our expensive shrubbery on our estates. We have browsing by deer on tree seedlings and wildflowers, and the tick-borne disease. And you had a lot of people who were really not too comfortable with hunting coming around to the idea that, no, we needed to do something. And so this is just a recent example from November. The deer went through the windshield of this very popular artist, and it was done. So 25 or 30 collisions a year, but they're probably not all reported. And we have a synergy, most likely, between deer collision and coyote, where the coyotes clean up the crippled deer after a collision. So the proposal was to open the forest to bow hunters. And this is the kind of thing that happens. It happened in Blue Hills near Boston, but it happened in Weston too. There are people who go to town meeting and will become furious at the suggestion that you would allow hunters into the local town. And so we have people on the street, people with signs. Town meeting has these people coming to say their piece. The town invited in biologists and tick ecologists and so on to talk about the value of this, and the dispute rages. And as you know, some towns in New England decide we don't have the votes. Weston had the votes. Conservation Commission supported it. Brian Donahue, who you'll meet on Friday, was the chairman of the Conservation Commission at the time, and he strongly supported the hunt. And so the hunt went forward. And the way it works is, if you're a bow hunter interested in hunting in Weston, you have to apply. You have to have 5 years of experience. You have to go before a couple of master bowmen who will interview you. You have to do a target practice while they watch to show them that you can hit the target. You have to promise to only shoot from a tree stand. You have to promise to follow the map showing where you can hunt. And you have to report your deer. On the other hand, the state of Massachusetts is very interested in reducing the deer population in suburban Boston. And so if you really have the time on your hands and you're very careful at tracking the periodic updates in the fall of the antlerless deer permits, you can actually legally harvest 11, 12, 13 deer. And yeah, you're not restricted to one or two. You know, one buck or 2 bucks perhaps, but you can harvest many, many, many deer in this region of Massachusetts. And I know one gentleman who last year got something like 7, and I'm still enjoying his venison sausage. So here he is, in fact. There's his buck. Now, so this is what it looks like. You're in full camo up in a tree stand about 30 feet, and you're waiting. And you do a lot of waiting if you're an archer. The Deer and Moose Program Director is very skeptical. That's his title, by the way, State of Massachusetts Director of Deer and Moose. And he is very skeptical that a bow hunt alone will have the effect of reducing deer to something like 5 per square mile, and therefore actually see this reduction in Lyme or tick abundance. But no one has found out. No one really knows. But we have a very eager population of hunters still in the area. Many of them are first responders. There's kind of like a club of firefighters and police officers and ambulance drivers that love to hunt. And they learn about these towns that are proposing a hunt, and they are the first to reply, or first to apply. Here's my buddy Dan. Last name is actually Wolf. Just last October. And he killed 7 deer last fall because he's very careful at watching for the constantly update of the list of available antlerless deer permits. Of course, he sent me the picture of his buck. You know, he loves, and that's his crossbow. One of the reasons the director of Deer and Moose is skeptical is that the places you can legally hunt in Weston are very small. You have to be 500 feet away from an occupied building and from some hundreds of feet from a road. And so in the town of Weston, shown in the black, the red areas are where you're actually allowed to hunt. Now, there are big estates, and some of the owners of the big estates have always invited in the hunters. So there's more area of the town than is just shown here. This is on public land, the areas that you can actively hunt. And this is the result up until 2016. The number of deer killed on those big estates is shown in blue, and then the controlled hunt started in 2012, and my research started in the summer of 2013. So this is the fall of 2012. The hunt begins, And I started collecting ticks, and I've been collecting ticks for, this was my 6th year. And so we do have good data on this from other places. This is a study that was done in Connecticut. After hunts were initiated, the number and frequency of deer observations in the community were greatly reduced, as were resident reported cases of Lyme. Number of resident reported cases of Lyme per 100 was strongly correlated to deer density in the community. Reduction of deer density to 5 deer per square kilometer resulted in a 70% reduction in tick abundance, 70% reduction in the entomological risk index, and 80% reduction in resident reported cases of Lyme. This is a place where they were allowed to use shotgun. And the guy who's my deer and moose director, my consultant on the ecology of deer and moose, one of the reasons he's skeptical is because bow hunters are going to see a lot more deer than they will ever responsibly choose to shoot at. Whereas a well-sighted shotgun with a scope and a buckshot can hit a deer much higher, greater range from the same tree stand. So we don't really know the answer. This was a shotgun area. Weston is bow hunting only. And here is the result from that study in Connecticut. The hunt is initiated here. And look at the plunge in ticks. When I saw these data, I began to wonder, wait a minute. I really wonder if this is real. Because it just seems too soon. The 2-year life cycle, remember that? It seems like there should be a longer delay between, they're not shooting the ticks. This looks like they're shooting the ticks. So I really wonder, and look at this, I can't call it anything but an uptick. Sorry. I'm allowed one of those jokes a lecture. I checked, I'm allowed one a lecture. But anyway, look at that, what's going on? So I need to get in touch with these authors. I really hope they're continuing to sample and see if this is some sort of odd result. So will it work? I don't really know the answer. But so I got training. Here's my training team in 2013 in May. Tom Mather is so generous. He's a professor of biology at University of Rhode Island, and he's a tick specialist. And he sent me out with his guys. Here's Adam Krebs from the Brandeis. He was on a WOW fellowship, a summer paid research assistantship. I'm very grateful to Brandeis for that. And these other 4 crazies are all tick researchers for Tom. And the basic method is to drag your sheet. You walk along behind it for 30 seconds, counting to yourself or using a stopwatch. And at the end of 30 seconds, you pick up your sheet and you look very carefully for ticks, and you put them in a vial. So each transect, 30-second sweep, 30 seconds of sweep. It's about 5 square meters in area, 25 bouts. I do 25 sweeps per morning, about 125 square meters swept per visit. And there we are, sweeping, looking, picking a tick off, putting it in a vial, and writing down our results on a card. Have big stacks of these cards. The data in ecology looks really crude when you first collect it, and that's just the nature of it. So again, if you look at it, it's about a 18 centimeter wide drag, and you walk approximately 30 meters in 30 seconds, and you get, so if you have 1 tick per sweep, that means there's about 1,428 ticks per soccer-sized field in your forest. And what do the data look like? Well, the first year, I just didn't know what to expect. Was it real? Could I actually have, results I thought I could trust? And this pattern was so gratifying, because what you see is that from June to July, every site we were working in had a similar pattern. The high places stayed high, the low places stayed low, and they all came down. Why did they come down? Because the nymphs are either finding a blood meal and then dropping out of the leaf litter, so we're not going to catch them, or they die from some predator or a spider or something. And so they're all expected to come. There's one place that went up a bit in that site, but the high places stayed high, the low places stayed low. This told me that we have a method, and I learned it from the guys in Rhode Island, and we can trust the data. And so what did the data look like? Are you all ready? Ticks have crashed. These are the 3 sites I've looked at so far. Central Jericho is heavily forested. Cat Rock Park is more diverse, sort of younger forest. And College Land, look at this. We had 2, almost 3 ticks per sweep. That's 3,000 ticks per soccer-sized field plot in that forest. And we're down into the less than 1 tick per sweep a few years later. I don't believe it. I don't think this is due to the hunt. And I'm really curious to know if the other researchers are going to be willing to talk about their doubts too. What else could it be? Remember their results? Really a quick crash after the hunt was instituted. We know that adverse moisture can really cut back on tick, not just the survivor, but also not just the survival, but also the activity of ticks. And so this is a student from Tom Mather's lab who looked at, they used electronic data loggers to look at relative humidity in the leaf litter. I didn't know to do this, and it would have taken a very much more of an elaborate study to look at this. You begin an ecological study 10 years long, and you just don't know. But boy, was that guy right when he said it's going to take time to be confident. I have a population I'm studying that has crashed. And I really am very skeptical that it's due to the hunt. But I mean, we had a very severe dry season, 2016. Those of you from New England may remember this. This is July. Here's August. Here's August a little later. Here's September. And by the end of September, most of Massachusetts was in extreme drought. Farmers lost their crops. The forest was tinder dry. And we were finding very, very few ticks. But if you look back at the results, ticks started to fall well before 2016. And so I began to wonder, okay, look deeper in the records. And we have, so remember I started in 2013. 2011 and 2012 and 2013 were all like 20 inches of rain in those 5 months. Remember, you're supposed to use relative humidity in the leaf litter. So this is a very crude index of that. You know, I don't really pretend this is anything like the study that was done. But then if you look later, my next year of sample was just 62% of that. In other words, if you take 20.3 inches as sort of like the 3-year average of rain in the summer in previous years, 2 years before and then the year of my study, and then after, 62%, only 70%, and then 40% in that terrible drought year. And now, last year, we're back up to about 87% of the 3-year average of rainfall. These are sort of, this is the data from the Weather Service showing that every year of my study has had below average rain, especially 2016. So, I kind of have a hunch. I just don't believe. I started too soon. The decline started too soon. We know ticks are sensitive to drought, and so I'm really doubtful. What's the conclusions? I need more time. I love going out there. I love this stuff. It seems like anybody could do this, right? But I love being in the woods, and I love collecting and seeing if I can get some science to come out of the noise. But regardless, say we show that the tick abundance has gone down by 75%. Will people will they start letting their kids play in the woods? I don't know. But dress like this guy. You look, his white socks and his pant leg is tucked in. We don't get sick. I've had now 5 years of these young people working with me. Not one has gotten sick in my 5 years. Dozens of helpers, field assistants of all sorts, from Brandeis, from Newton High School, from my friends in the Newton community. None of them have gotten sick. I've gotten sick twice, but I know where those happened, and it wasn't during my research. It was stupid, but anyway, that's another story. The bullseye rash. If you have these symptoms and you find a tick, get into your doctor, get some of the doxy, and it's good to learn some of the symptoms of the other diseases. I can describe babesiosis in great detail. There's the bullseye rash. It doesn't always occur Get treated, because these are some of the symptoms that people report who aren't treated. I mean, neurological difficulty concentration, profound fatigue, facial palsy, frank psychosis. I mean, this is not a happy thing. This is a really serious illness. In 1920, we thought we'd be done with all these infectious diseases, and here we are today in New England, living with fear of the forest. It's really quite a story. This is very promising. I'll just show you that slide again. Keep your eye on that as a vaccine. If you're someone who loves going in the woods, if you've had Lyme already and don't want to have it again, you might want to seek this out as soon as it's released. And then there's always this solution. This was actually proposed for Maine. And of course they're not going to stay in Maine, right? and so too many deer on the road, let cougars back in. This is a serious study. I can get you the result, the citation. But the big cats are spreading, of course, and there's deer specialists. Wherever deer occur, you find the cougar. Wherever cougar occur, you find the deer. They're really closely united. Just some acknowledgments. Good support from Brian Donahue and the Town of Weston Conservation Commission. Thank you very much.
Q&A with both our presenters.
All right. Hey, they're really, they're sealed. They're sealed.
I feel like a rock star with this mic. Is it working? Okay.
Hello. Thank you both. So my question came to mind when Miranda was speaking, but it's sort of broadly applicable, and something I've kind of been hearing maybe for the last 5 years or so. So it's this maybe almost an ethical conflict between conservation as get it back to the way it used to be versus conservation prepare it for what we think might be coming. And I wondered if you could just speak to the current debate or if you feel one way or the other more strongly. Do you kind of understand my question?
Yeah, I do. We're not going to be able to go back to the age of mammoths and mastodons and have all the wild lands that we once did. And I guess my first thought is that it's going to have to be a compromise because, yeah, we need to find a way to have conservation of biodiversity in the world that's going to happen. However, we also need to make sure that the world as it's going to turn out allows for that conservation of biodiversity at the same time. So it's going to have to be a compromise and work both ways because, to be honest, from my perspective, and this is perhaps a very dire way of looking at it, but if we just continue and we don't make allowances to make sure conservation is happening at the same time, we are not going to be able to exist. So if we want to continue to exist, we also have to make space for all these other things. Now, in some cases, that's going to mean that we have an area that's been put aside to keep the wild parts going that we depend on. In other places, it's going to mean that we're living there along with the other organisms side by side.
It seems to me like it came up at a conference I was at a bunch of years ago. It was like a national park science conference, and the young man was presenting his thesis basically, and very boldly said, like, why are we sticking fish that used to be in a pond 100 years ago back in the pond if they naturally just didn't end up there over time. And he bristled a lot of people in the audience, and I thought that was cool that he just boldly said that. And over time, as climate change has become a much more talked about topic, it's sort of sat in the back of my head, is there a scale at which we go, oh, well, we're not going to try to conserve what it was 100 years ago, but, maybe 10 years ago if we can get that back or something like that. So do you sense a timeline? I'm sure it's species
like
dependent.
a point of we can
No,
get
yeah,
back
like
to-
don't bother. It's too far in the past. We moving forward.
I'm gonna do the classic ecologist thing.
Well, no,
it
it's
depends.
It does, doesn't it? Right?
So in some cases, it's one of those things. They say one of the number one things you need to consider if you're looking at a reintroduction study, which is what you're talking about, is why that species disappeared in the first place.
Yeah.
So was it because we hunted them all? Okay, in which case, as long as we're not going to do that again and we can live with them being there, things might work out. Or was it because there's no habitat left that's really suitable for them? Which is the case with some organisms in climate change. If that is the case, then you can't put them back because they're not going to survive there anymore.
And I think there's an economic component that, right,
Yes.
that presses on things. So even if an ecological answer is one way, if there's an economic impetus, I come from a forestry side of things, and so this idea about people's lives tied to the money that comes from something, and that does seem to be a component of decision making that's sort of outside of ecology. Do you find that you sort of edge over into public policy sort of stuff in your role?
I don't personally, but I know many that do. So it's definitely a consideration. I mean, for example, just the Nile perch that I talked about earlier, the horribly invasive species in Lake Victoria supports a lot of fishing communities, and it's now been so heavily fished that it's almost considered endangered in that lake. So there's the flip side of that coin. So yeah, that's a problem. I don't end up going into that so much anymore, but many ecologists do.
So I had a data and math question. So are you both using R for your statistical analysis?
If not, what do you use?
Exactly.
R.
Okay.
Definitely use R.
And so I worked with an ecologist in one of his classes, and he had them do particular modeling. And I'm wondering how often you guys are sharing, like publicly sharing your data, and if you also, when you publish, do you publish your actually mathematical models?
So my work to date has been entirely empirical. I haven't modeled a thing. I'm a field biologist in the purest sense. And when I needed some statistical help, I went down the hall to my statistician and I said, this must be really complicated, right? And for my PhD, I ended up doing contingency tables. And he said, one of the fundamental errors in science is you think you need a more sophisticated statistical test than you really do. And so I did it on a hand calculator, and it went just fine. My defense was accepted. So, it really depends. The tick work goes on. And I'm sort of just looking graphically at my standard error bars and saying, yeah, that's statistically significant. So it depends. When I do finally come to the point, I've consulted with some statisticians on all my sites and my months and I've stumped one guy already. So we'll see where it goes with statistics. But I don't do much modeling.
I've done a lot of modeling, but since I really got into the more statistically heavy parts of my research, the data that I've been working with haven't been my own to share. When I did my PhD work, it was from many other people, so it wasn't up to me to publicize that data. The data from my earlier research didn't end up going out there, but presenting your data openly wasn't so much a thing back then. If I were to be doing it now, it would be something I would be more hopeful of doing, and actually a lot of funding institutions are now requiring that you somehow do that, which is a really good thing, but you have to figure out how to do it because it can be expensive, actually.
I had a question on the tick control, other than the hunting.
Yeah.
I summer take vacations on Long Island, and they do the 4 posters with the insecticide. Is that, do you think, adequate tick control, or is it something that you know much about?
So I have seen those in action. Do you want to describe for the folks what you see on Long Island?
What they do in this place I go, Shelter Island, they have deer feeding stations in the woods, and to get the deer reach into the feed station, and there's posts, rolling posts that spread insecticide along the necks of the deer while they eat. And so that's one way to, to control the actual ticks. They also do hunting on that island too, but it probably has more ticks than any place else in all of the world. It's Tick City.
Long Island is famous. So I think the way to think about it from the point of view of a lot of the towns, if they're able to get a hunt approved, they view that as extraordinarily cost effective, because there's this eager group of people around us who actually pay to hunt, right? They buy a hunting license, and they are willing to drive themselves to the site and get out there at 4:30 in the morning on a frosty October morning and sit up there in the tree. And all these other things that we could talk about, like this, these posts throughout the 2,000 acres of wildland, 19 square miles of Weston, or sterilization with, darting and so on, they're all going to cost a lot of money. And so I think a town will always try the hunt first, and as long as it's approved, and if it does work, they'll say, wow, that was sure worth the money. And we paid for these master bowmen to give these these shops. In fact, they may actually be volunteers. But you're just not going to have volunteers going out, to do the sterilization. You're going to have to pay people to do that kind of work. And you just I can't see a guy going into the bar, darted 2 doe today. He wants the trophy, right? And so we have this eager group of hunters, and they're just totally into it. So open your community to hunting, and you might get a real free public health benefit.
In addition to the drought, did you also look at winters, because you hear, if we had a really bad cold winter, that killed some of the tick population? Just wondering if you're adding that to your data.
Yeah. This analysis of weather is really still something I'm working on right now. I wanted to focus on the summer temperatures. I haven't looked at winter. But we should look at winter cold, but also snow cover, because snow can serve as a kind of insulating blanket. So yeah, more things to analyze. I haven't done it yet.
I also have a tick question. Do the tick offer anything good? Are they like the sole food source of any other insects? Do they spread seeds? Do they spread pollen? I don't know.
So your question kind of hinges on or touches on this topic. I don't say you're asking this, but I do want to say it's interesting sometimes. Lay people will ask me, what's the purpose of a mosquito? Why are they part of our world? And as an ecologist, you're always sort of, taken aback by that question, because, of course, the purpose of a mosquito is simply to make more mosquitoes. And if you ask a mosquito, what is your purpose? They would just say sex. To find like a purpose, I think it's kind of a, but I don't think that you were asking that. I just wanted to prepare you for this question from lay people. You may be asked that sometimes, and you have to sort of wind back from the question. The premise is wrong. The premise is wrong. Organisms don't exist for some other thing. The bee doesn't visit the flower to pollinate it. The bee visits the flower so it wants to make more baby bees, and it gets resources, and by accident, it has no idea it's doing this. It pollinates the flower. And so, we have to change our perspective about this whole notion of purpose. But does the tick, so would the removal of the tick, would the demise of the tick actually affect the forest in some way? And, you know, if you look back in just 50, 60 years ago, lime was really, really rare. These ticks have resurged as the forests of New England have regrown and deer have become so abundant, and other small mammals have come back into the proximity of homes. My grandfather was born in 1900, and he grew up his whole life in a small town in Wisconsin. And he says, when he was a teenager, it was front page news. A deer was sighted in Clark County. It was like, you know, all the deer had been completely eradicated, and the forests of New England were mostly cut. And so you look out on the world today, and it's very different from the 1800s. The forest has boomed back, deer are back, those cabals of turkeys lurk around, watch out for them. You know, it's an amazing change. To an ecologist, we see this as phenomenal resurgence. And now the coyote mixed with wolf genes and so on is back. You know, we've got maybe mountain lion someday.
I am fairly new to working with scientists and the types of work that they do. And so one of the reasons I'm here is to kind of learn a bit more about how to support them as a librarian. Can you both talk about some times or some points in your various research projects in which you used library or research services and collections?
Oftentimes when I've really needed outside help from people working at the library, it's been because I know that there's a source out there for something. You know, Web of Science tells me it's there, it exists, but I can't get it because the university hasn't subscribed to that particular program or something like that. So it's about trying to chase it down for me and help me find that particular source. So often ends up being a loan situation or something like that. And I think that's the primary way that I've ended up really interacting with librarians for my own research purposes recently.
Well, when I was finishing up my PhD at Penn, my wife got a better job up here. We moved to Cambridge, and Harvard has this very unusual policy. If you are doing a PhD anywhere in the world, you can come to Harvard and have access to our libraries. You have to be a doctoral student. Not even alumni can get access to the libraries at Harvard. It's a real blessing. And boy, was that a blessing to finish my dissertation with all of the resources of Harvard. Nowadays, so much is done online. With the Web of Science, it's a miracle. The Web of Science is truly amazing. And so there's almost no excuse anymore for not being completely up to date on the literature, and you can sit in your kitchen sipping coffee and get there. It's really a phenomenal thing. That said, I still love going to the libraries and just browsing the journals and sitting in that quiet. And at times, I definitely have been aided by the science librarians. Finding an obscure journal, I use interlibrary loan all the time. That is a very useful tool. And boy, are you guys quick. I don't know who's out there like running down the stacks to get that journal article sent off, but it's really a blessing.
I've got kind of a follow-up question to that. Miranda had mentioned kind of in a little mini Q&A earlier that, somebody had asked about the cartoon, and she suggested if somebody encountered that might be a point at which they want to do a literature search. So can you speak a little bit more specifically onto at what points in the project where you said, oh, I need to go find this?
Okay, so I guess hopefully as a researcher working on a project, you're doing that continually. So at the very beginning, when you're first trying to get into your topic and figure out even what your questions are, you're going to be doing a massive literature search, and you're really going to be looking for everything out there connected to it and trying to read up and get your baseline knowledge up to snuff on that topic. But then I think continually as you work along, you're going to constantly come across something and say, oh, someone it seems like this might be important. I read this might be important. So you follow the trail of breadcrumbs, and that's going to continue for the entire time you're working on that project. Not to mention, hopefully as a researcher, you're also making a good use of the alerts available to you, so that if there is something published on your topic in that period, you're going to hopefully be notified of it. But I would recommend that any student of mine coming up on, even if they don't run into a situation where there's been some anomaly, but coming up to their defense and their write-off, that they go and repeat those searches yet again, just to see what else is out there that the alerts might have missed.
Yeah, I can't add much to that. I just think it's a continuous process that you really need to do. I think one of the questions like this arose because, you see something completely unexpected in your results, and the doctoral student comes to you practically in tears and says, my tick population crashed. I have the benefit of long term. I'm here, not going anywhere. I love my teaching job. I'm really hired to teach. The tick work is sort of like frosting on my, they're happy I'm doing it, but it's not make or break for me in career anymore. And so I have the luxury of finding some crash in my population and just saying, well, we'll see what happens, So, but this doctoral student, that's a harder thing, Connell, we were talking about Johnson Connell. He once came on one of my field courses, and he said to the ecologist students in the course, he said, a good rule of thumb is this: don't study anything bigger than this. Because if you study mountain lions for a dissertation, oh boy, or jaguar.
This is why I used other people's data.
So you have to feel for the dissertation doctoral student who wants to wrap up and get out there 5 years, come on. And something really bad happens to their big organism, and they don't have many more years to just get the population back up, continue with the study. That can happen. It's a risk. You can always go into, stocks and bonds, I guess.
Very briefly on that note, I know someone who did his thesis on the clouded leopard in Taiwan, and the end conclusion was that it was extinct in Taiwan. And it took about 10 years for him to finish that up. But he did it, and he did a great job of it eventually too, coming up with various models for different aspects.
Showing
of it.
that something is gone is
it definitely
really hard.
happens.
Really hard.
I'm first-year librarian. I am learning all the new databases related to my patrons, biology, chemistry, environmental science. And it takes time to learn those new tools. So my question is, scientists, researchers are self-sustained people, like you are competing, time is there, so many other things. So do you have, how do you manage your time to learn those new tools, new databases? Like, do you have time for it?
No.
I know. So how could librarian be more helpful to you? Like, because this is our job to learn this and convey in your area. Like, how can, did I ask correct? I don't know.
No, it's a good question.
It's a great question. I think a lot of the time we know a tool is out there and we don't learn it until we absolutely have to, and it becomes a necessity. So it becomes okay, well, I'm gonna need the results from this on Friday, so it's Wednesday, and now's the time I'm gonna spend the next 24 hours doing this. I think oftentimes that's how it goes. So things become very urgent in a situation like that, and we might come running to you saying, oh no, we need help. But it's one of those things, and it varies from one person to the next how they schedule their time and how they do that. I know I really have things laid out, but for many people that's not how it works. And they really are running up against the deadlines. So I don't have a good answer.
One thing that occurs to me is, as a new science librarian, if there are some kind of, I know they're rare, but friendly faculty who are, no, I'm just kidding. There are lots of friendly faculty who may be using these tools and be familiar with them. I wouldn't hesitate to ask, what's been helpful to you with this tool? What have you found to be of use to you with this database? Why do you like it? What are your complaints about it? You know, maybe some collaboration there would be of help.
If there's a new tool out there and you have a scheduled time for people to learn it, sometimes they'll block out that 1 hour and actually make it work. And once it's on the calendar, they're just going to end up going whether or not it fits. So that can be a good way to do it.
Mine kind of bounces off of that, but more in your students' perspective. So thinking about how are your students learning about the resources that the library has? Because I know personally I try to get into as many classes as I can to provide instruction, even if it's just like 5 minutes to show the resources. But how can we make that better for you, and how are you currently doing that?
So, okay, I'm not teaching this class right now, but for a time I was teaching a course, just Introduction to Ecology. And one of the assignments was to do a literature review on a topic and write a mini pre-proposal on what you would need to do to advance that topic farther. It's like, creating little mini proto-grad students who would actually be eventually assigned the task of coming up with a question. And so the students had to turn in a couple of drafts of this little mini pre-proposal, and they had to show that they had citations from that year. And the only way to do that was with Web of Science, really. And so I would ask them, how many people have used Web of Science? And no. Every now and then one of the students in the class had used it, and I say, well, I'm about to change your life. It's just amazing. And so I'd show them on the screen how it works, and then their pre-proposals included yesterday's results. So that was an assignment.
And we have a course that some of the undergraduates participate in, and one of the librarians here helps us with, and for undergraduates where they actually go to the library and get taught how to use the databases there. And so that's how our undergraduates hopefully learn how to do it. As a graduate student, it becomes much more of, well, you're going to learn it because you need it now, and you're probably going to learn it from either me showing you learning it on your own, or from a lab mate. So.
This is kind of a question, not so much ecology, it's more of for the ticks. And I'm just thinking, my kids for camp, I had to sign them up, had to spray them with bug spray and sunblock, the DEET, 10%. And then I have other family members who've actually had their lawn sprayed with whatever pesticides. And then I had another friend who actually got 6 cats to keep all kinds of critters away. What are your thoughts on that? Because I know it's like, to me, it reminds me of just introducing something that shouldn't be there, and not to mention toxic, but I'm just kind of curious of your thoughts. We can't dress them in a...
So these cats are allowed outside, and they roam around and kill stuff? Yeah. No, as an ecologist, I'd probably say, let's get rid of them cats. It's just terrible. The carnage on songbirds is just astounding. Some cats are really good at it. Some are completely bad at it. But it seems like there's a good number of cats. And I used to have one. I would bring home the cardinal. We'd come around before my dad got home. He was feeding the birds. The cat was eating the birds. A little food web in the backyard. And we would try to get home before my dad so that we could find the head of the cardinal and put it in the trash, No, the cats outdoors is not a good idea. So there's my little contribution. But in terms of, yes, the insecticides do help. I don't use them because when we sample ticks, I can't, repel the ticks. So it's all about dress and tick checks. Every hour we do a tick check, and we see if there's ticks crawling up our white socks onto our white pants and on our white shirt. When we're doing the tick sampling, we look like we're on our way to some fancy cocktail party or something, all in white. But that's my preventative, is the way I dress and my behavior. But I know people swear on, is it permethrin-treated clothing? Am I saying that word right? You see, I'm so unfamiliar with these permethrin. And Tom Mather, who taught me to tick sample, he says that's a fantastic preventative. And I guess the DEET works. Of course, the DEET will work for mosquitoes too. And so, you don't have the pest of mosquitoes as well. I hope that helps you.
I had a question about instruction, and it was asked already. I concur. It's occasionally difficult to get you guys to invite us in, so I'm delighted to hear there are assignment-driven things. I think from our perspective, if you all enjoy us coming into your classroom, tell your colleagues. That we appreciate the advocacy. So thank you.
Noted.
I actually had a question for you, Miranda, and also for you, Robbie. As ecologists, and Eric also, as ecologists, how do you look at what's happening with climate change and just all the awful things that are happening and not lose your optimism and your hope and your, and I'm not even speaking politically, I'm just speaking, environmentally, the way things are headed. How do you maintain, or do you maintain positive hope, positive outlook in your work?
I'm not a very optimistic person. But that aside, I guess you just look at it as one of those things where, I often don't know, honestly, if we are going to be successful in solving a lot of these problems. Although I've talked to many other ecologists who are much more positive about it, so maybe you should ask them as well. But I guess my main way of thinking about it is that it's still a fight worth fighting, and so you do everything you can. And you just keep going with that and be happy with that, because that's all you can do. And I guess that's the only way I can look at it. Because a lot of these problems are so huge and they're all interconnected and honestly linked to our own population growth. And I don't have an answer to them on that, but that's how I look at it.
This is Robbie Bagchi. He's Miranda's husband and also an ecologist.
Hello. Unexpected input. So I'm probably the optimist of the two of us. And I would say primarily as an ecologist, I see global environmental change as an opportunity because my research looks at how environmental change affects ecological communities. So it keeps me in a job. So that keeps me optimistic. I guess the second thing is, I agree with Miranda that it's a fight worth fighting. And I think if we give up, then we're not going to do very well. And I guess even if we lose, I think it's relative. I think environmental change is not going to wipe out life on Earth. It probably won't even wipe out, unless there was a nuclear holocaust. It's probably not even going to wipe humans out on its own, unless there was some disease or something that we managed to exacerbate. But I think it can reduce our quality of life. And I think what we're doing is we're fighting for quality of life. We're really lucky living in the 21st century in North America. It's a really cushy life. And I think and that life is worth fighting for, and environmental change is probably the predominant threat to that lifestyle. And so that's why I keep going. And I've got kids, and I want them to have the lifestyle I have, and I guess that's why I keep going.
So I have two quotes. One, Mark Twain said, "Predictions are really difficult, especially about the future." That quote. And so if we were to somehow give up and then we could really turn climate change around, how would we feel? I mean, you've got to fight until, you got to just be optimistic. And then another quote is H.G. Wells, who's known for his science fiction, right? But he was an essayist and philosopher, and he said, humanity is often in a race between catastrophe and education. And so I think we're in one of those moments. And that was a quote from a book where he tried to summarize, believe it or not, like all of world history in one book. It was maybe viewed as possible back in the 1920s when he was writing. But I think that is what we're confronting right now, and we move forward in fits and starts and fall back at times, and some countries fall back more dramatically than others. But I teach a course called Energy and Development. I'm as was mentioned in the introduction, I am very interested in energy because energy is the core issue of climate change. Land use change is big too, but energy is the dominant. So I've become very interested in the trends of renewable energy, and it's amazing what's happened. The offshore wind potential off of New England could run the entire state of Massachusetts, including all the electric cars we have to buy as we switch away from internal combustion engines. So this huge state with all of its wealth and all of its fancy homes and so on can be powered by offshore wind. And so let's go. Let's do it. It's just a matter of political will now, really. It's not an engineering challenge. I mean, we know we can do it. And every day the advances in storage and higher performance solar panels and higher performing wind turbines and other advances come along. So I'm actually in the optimistic camp. But it does require better decision making and political will.
All right, I think that is an excellent question to close on. We are at time. Thank you so much to both of our presenters. And everybody's got their little schedule in their lanyards. I didn't point that out earlier, but just as a reminder, mentors and mentees are encouraged to stay and get to know each other. Everybody else gets to entertain themselves for half an hour because the dining hall is not expecting us until 5.